Imagine culture as, I don't know, a giant bustling marketplace.
Yeah.
Super busy.
Okay, yeah, I like that.
Before the 1960s, you had some folks, the literary types like T.S. Eliot, Frank, and Dorothy Leavis. They were mostly interested in the really high-end stalls.
The fancy boutiques.
Exactly. And they were kind of worried about the uncultured masses, as they saw them, maybe messing things up, lowering the tone.
Almost like gatekeepers, right? They even pictured themselves as cultural missionaries trying to sort of civilize everyone else,
All right.
which seems, well, a bit much looking back. But let's unpack this because then over in Birmingham, England, this group popped up.
The Birmingham School.
Yeah, and they decided to look at the whole marketplace, especially the stalls where, most people were actually hanging out.
Which is such a shift, isn't it? Moving away from that really narrow focus on just the elite culture. They wanted to see what everyone was buying, what everyone was talking about. Totally. And that curiosity, that's what we're digging into today.
Yeah.
This is our deep dive into the Birmingham School, officially called the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, or CCCS.
Founded in 1964, University of Birmingham.
And you can think of them as like the cultural anthropologists of their day. They were fascinated by everything: youth, subcultures, TV shows, music, the media.
Basically how culture worked in real everyday life, not just in museums or lecture halls. They wanted to understand the meaning behind it all.
So our mission here is to figure out how this group, key people like Richard Hoggart, Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, Dick Hebdige, how they completely changed the game for how we look at culture and media.
Moving from those kind of dusty top-down pronouncements.
Yeah, to the messy, vibrant reality of how people actually live and use culture. We'll get into their big ideas, why they caused such a stir, and why they still matter.
And you really have to understand the context, the setting. Britain in the 1960s.
Right. What was going on then?
Well, you had this post-war economic boom happening, but also the rise of the socialist New Left movement. Okay. And this movement was really strongly against racism, colonialism, pushing hard for equal rights. It created this atmosphere of questioning authority, questioning the status quo.
So that whole social and political background was crucial. It wasn't just happening in a vacuum.
Absolutely not. It was the soil the Birmingham School grew out of. You can't separate their ideas from that specific time and place.
Okay, so where does the story really start? With Richard Hoggart.
Richard Hoggart, yeah.
Yeah.
He was the first director of the CCCS, and he's an interesting figure because he came from a working class background himself, but then went through university.
So he kind of straddled both worlds.
Exactly. He had lived that culture, but he also had the academic tools to analyze it. And his big book from 1957 was The Uses of Literacy.
The uses of literacy, what was that about?
It was like, well, like you said earlier, almost an ethnographic study, a really detailed look at working class culture.
What kind of things did he look at?
Their reading habits, not just books, but magazines, newspapers, their entertainment, the songs they sang, the values they held. It was incredibly detailed.
And what was his main argument?
His key point was that people weren't just passively soaking up popular culture, as some kind of mindless escape.
Which was kind of the view back then, wasn't it? That pop culture was just trivial.
Very much so. It was often dismissed as lowbrow, degenerate even. But Hoggart argued people were actively using it. They were using these cultural forms to make sense of their lives, to reinforce their experiences, their communities.
So taking it seriously, treating it as something meaningful.
Precisely. And he did it without being condescending, which was rare among intellectuals looking at popular culture at the time. He wanted to understand its function.
Did anyone push back on that? Maybe say he was being a bit positive about it.
That's a fair point. Some critics later did suggest he might have perhaps romanticized working class culture a little, maybe glossed over some complexities or downsides, but his sympathetic, detailed approach was still groundbreaking.
Okay, so after Hoggart, who's next? Stuart Hall.
Stuart Hall, yeah. The second director and a hugely influential figure.
Yeah.
If Hoggart was the ethnographer, Hall was maybe the codebreaker.
The codebreaker of culture. I like that.
He made this really useful distinction between mass culture and popular culture.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Mass culture is the stuff that's industrially produced. Think, Hollywood blockbusters, pop music churned out by big labels. It's standardized, made for a mass market.
Right, a factory product.
Kind of.
Yeah.
But popular culture for Hall was what people did with that stuff, how they actually took it, used it, maybe changed it, made it their own. The active engagement part.
So popular culture is more about the audience's role.
Exactly. And that leads directly into his most famous idea, the encoding and decoding model.
Ah, okay. I've heard of this. Encoding, decoding. Break it down for us.
So think of any media message, a news report, an advertisement, a TV show. The creators, Hall said, they encode that message.
Meaning, they put their own ideas, their own viewpoints, their own assumptions into it, based on their background, their interests.
Right. They embed a sort of preferred meaning into the text, hoping the audience will understand it that way. It's constructed based on certain ideological frameworks.
Okay, so the message gets sent out with this intended meaning baked in.
And this is the crucial part, the audience doesn't just passively receive it and go, okay, got it. They have to decode it.
Using their own filters, their own experiences, their own social position.
Precisely. Your background, your beliefs, your daily life, all that shapes how you interpret the message you receive.
And Hall said there were different ways people could decode, right?
Yeah, he outlined three main positions. First, the dominant or preferred reading.
That's where you basically accept the message as intended. You buy into the code.
Exactly. You decode it in the way the encoder expected or hoped. It aligns with the dominant ideology.
Okay, what's the second way?
The negotiated reading. This is where the audience broadly accepts the preferred meaning, but they adapt it a bit to fit their own specific situation or experiences.
So like, okay, I get the main point, but for me, it also means this. Kind of modifying it.
Yeah, a bit of give and take. They acknowledge the dominant message, but allow room for local interpretation. It's probably the most common response, actually.
And the third one?
That's the oppositional reading. This is where the audience completely rejects the preferred meaning. They understand what the intended message likely is, but they decode it in a contrary way, often drawing on alternative or counter-ideological frameworks.
So they see the code, but they read it totally differently, maybe even using it against the sender's intention.
Exactly. It's like the sender and receiver are speaking the same language, culturally speaking, but using completely different dictionaries or dialects sometimes.
Wow, that really emphasizes the power of the audience, doesn't it? They're not just sponges.
Not at all. They're active meaning makers. And that was a huge contribution from Hall in the Birmingham School, moving away from those old models of media, just injecting ideas into passive minds.
Okay, so we've had Hoggart the ethnographer, Hall the codebreaker. Who else was central? Raymond Williams.
Raymond Williams, absolutely fundamental. He really laid a lot of the theoretical groundwork.
Yeah.
You could maybe think of him as the meticulous map maker of the cultural landscape.
The map maker. Okay.
How so?
Well, he tackled the big question, what even is culture? He argued it wasn't just high art or, intellectual stuff.
Which was a common definition back then.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Williams traced how the word culture had been used. He initially identified, I think, 4 meanings. Something like the ideal of human perfection, a body of artistic work, a specific way of life, and then intellectual, material, spiritual aspects.
So complicated.
It is. He later refined it down to 3 main categories. The ideal, like human perfection, the documentary, the body of artistic and intellectual work, and the social, a particular way of life. The social meaning, like the anthropological sense.
Exactly. And for Williams, all these meanings were interconnected and important. He saw culture as the whole lived environment. It's the context, the atmosphere in which we make sense of everything.
The air we breathe, culturally speaking.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And he also gave us the concept of the selective tradition.
Selective tradition, what's that?
Think about history or literature or art. What gets remembered and passed down as our culture or our tradition?
Not everything, presumably.
Definitely not. Williams argued that what gets selected and preserved is always shaped by the interests and power structures of the present. Certain things are highlighted, kept alive, taught in schools, while others are ignored, forgotten, marginalized.
So tradition isn't neutral. It's always a result of choices, of selection based on certain values.
Absolutely. It's a continuous process of shaping and reshaping the past in the image of the present. He even famously said, there are no masses, there are only ways of seeing people as masses.
Wow, what do you mean by that?
He was pushing back against that tendency to lump people together into this undifferentiated blob, the masses, who are supposedly passive or easily manipulated. He insisted we see people as individuals and groups with their own agency, their own complex lives and viewpoints.
That's powerful. It connects back to Hoggart and Hall, too, taking ordinary people's experiences seriously.
It all fits together. They were all part of this broader project.
Okay, one more key figure you mentioned, Dick Hebdige. What was his focus?
Dick Hebdige, right. He took these ideas and applied them brilliantly to youth subcultures. If Williams mapped the landscape, Hebdige was maybe the explorer, venturing into these specific, vibrant cultural territories.
Like punk.
Exactly. His famous book from 1979, Subculture, The Meaning of Style, was largely about British punk.
And what did he find there? Just angry kids making noise.
Well, that was the common perception, maybe. But Hebdige argued that these subcultures with their really distinctive styles, the clothes, the hair, the music, were actually forms of resistance.
Resistance. Now,
Resistance against mainstream society, against dominant cultural norms. He saw their style not just as fashion, but as a language, a way of communicating dissent.
so the ripped clothes, the safety pins, the hairstyles, they meant something.
Profoundly so, within the context of the subculture. Hebdige talked about how subcultures take ordinary objects like that safety pin and give them new, symbolic meanings. It becomes a badge of identity, a signal of rebellion. Bricolage, he called it, taking everyday items and repurposing them.
So they were using style to create meaning and signal their difference.
Yes. He showed how these groups were often misunderstood, just dismissed as, thugs or clowns. But their style was actually a complex, meaningful response to their social situation, a way of commenting on and resisting the mainstream.
This collection of work from Hoggart, Hall, Williams, Hebdige, it sounds like it really shook things up.
Oh, definitely. It led to what's often called the cultural turn in academia.
The cultural turn.
Yeah, a fundamental shift across many disciplines. Sociology, history, literary studies, putting culture front and center. Moving away from purely economic or structural explanations and taking seriously how meaning, identity, and representation shape social life.
And it spread beyond Britain.
Hugely. It got called the British invasion in some academic fields because these ideas were so influential internationally. It was this move away from elitism towards taking the culture of ordinary people seriously.
And they didn't just sit in libraries, right? They did actual research.
Very often, yes. It wasn't just abstract theory. They often combined theoretical insights with empirical research, talking to people, observing youth groups, analyzing media content, getting out there.
Sounds really dynamic. But like any major intellectual movement, it must have faced some criticism.
Absolutely. No school of thought goes unchallenged.
What were some of the main critiques leveled against the Birmingham School?
Well, we touched on one earlier, the idea that they sometimes romanticized working class culture or subcultural resistance.
Overestimating their power to resist, perhaps?
Some argued that, that they might have given audiences a bit too much credit for being able to actively resist dominant media messages all the time, maybe underplaying the real power of media industries.
Okay, what else?
There were also debates about whether they adequately addressed the potentially negative sides of consumer culture. Were they too focused on resistance and meaning-making and not enough on how consumerism itself could be limiting or problematic?
And maybe the definition of culture became too broad, too vague.
That was another critique, that by trying to encompass everything, the analysis sometimes lost focus or precision. Defining culture as a whole way of life is powerful, but it can be hard to pin down analytically.
So, valid points of debate there.
For sure. But even with those criticisms, you can't deny the massive impact they had. They fundamentally changed the questions people asked about media, culture, and society. Why do people like certain things? What needs does popular culture fulfill? How is power exercised through culture?
Okay, so let's wrap this up. Thinking about everything we've discussed, what are the really key takeaways from the Birmingham School? What should we remember?
I think the biggest thing is looking beyond that old high culture, low culture divide. They taught us to see culture as this dynamic, contested space where meanings are constantly being made and fought over.
And that audiences aren't just passive lumps?
Definitely not. Audiences are active interpreters. We decode messages based on our own lives. That's crucial. And related to that, even things that seem superficial, fashion, music, style, can carry really deep social and political significance.
So why does understanding all this matter to, us today? To someone listening now?
Well, it makes you a more critical media consumer, doesn't it? It helps you think about the messages you're constantly receiving.
How they might be trying to shape how you see the world.
Exactly. And also how your background, your experiences affect how you understand those messages. It's a two-way street.
It kind of empowers you, reminding you that culture isn't just something beamed down from above.
Right. We're all participating in it, shaping it, resisting it, negotiating it every single day.
Okay, so a final thought to leave people mulling over.
Well, maybe think about the media you consume. Those codes Stuart Hall talked about, are you usually accepting the preferred reading? Or do you find yourself negotiating meanings or even pushing back, offering an oppositional reading?
Hmm. And what about subcultures today? Do they still exist in the same way?
That's a great question. What do the styles and preferences of different groups today tell us about our society? What forms does resistance take now? The questions the Birmingham School raised are still incredibly relevant. Their legacy really invites you to keep digging into the cultural world around you.